With the PS4 generation coming to an end, I thought now would be the perfect time to create my list. Wait, no, the official top 10 PS4 games of all time. Let's get right into it.
At number 10, this game's on here for a slightly different reason to many of the others, and I just had to find space in my top 10. It's not the greatest game for me, but it symbolized the entire next gen, always online approach and gave continual reasons to jump into the game. Destiny's visuals are stunning, with way more vivid colors than many games of a similar genre, and the gameplay itself was so exciting for the time. A classic FPS, but with superpowers and crazy aliens to kill. Riding around on your disappearing hoverbike and jumping off it straight into the action is a great time, as was the multiplayer Crucible, where it all got pretty crazy with everyone using their own special powers at the same time. It was like a sci-fi COD before COD itself went sci-fi, and basically a hero shooter before Overwatch. All the choices for factions as well, which seem to be in many similar games now. Destiny seemed to be the pioneer, and that deserves recognition. And it perfectly hyped up the PS4 for me. The advert with Giancarlo Esposito reading the lore of the jungle made me feel like a kid on Christmas Eve. So much so that I actually wanted a tattoo of the poem on my chest. Yes, I'm very glad I didn't get it, but I still think it would be cool. A game that had so much promise and excitement, and for me, it actually delivered as close to my expectations as you could actually possibly expect. Now, number 9, Ratchet and Clank. This game is simply pure childish joy. It's the same game I remembered from my childhood, but with a next gen sheen and gloss and some really cool little touches like NPCs throwing out comments like, "Haven't we done this before?" The crazy outlandish weapons that just make you feel like a big happy kid, like the disco bomb, which makes enemies dance about on the spot before it explodes, and the pixelator does as it sounds, turns enemies into pixelated versions of themselves. My favorite was the Pyrocitor, the flamethrower, as you can essentially run about holding down shoot and everything in front of you just dies. But switching up your weapons and using them all is all what Ratchet and Clank is all about. Gliding about with Clank is so fun, and just seeing the screen filled up with bolts after defeating a big group of enemies is that gratification you want from blowing up a load of robotic dogs and slimy aliens. It's also one of the few games that's genuinely laugh out loud funny with its cinematics, with the whole big bad of the game acting like he's just being a nice guy, turning up with killer robots, and anyone who dies will either deserve it or it will just be an accident. And he's really just there to make everything nice. There are also some pretty challenging sections which you feel like an achievement for completing, but the majority is just an old school, super fun platformer, and in my eyes, there aren't enough of those about these days. Now, at number 8, we have Journey. What can I say about Journey that hasn't already been said? Now, I know it technically came out on PS3, but it was right at the end of that generation, and I only played it on PS4, so I'm including it here. It's my list, sue me. Now, it starts off extremely confusing but surreally beautiful, and gradually you make your journey across desert and snow and start to piece together the story, which is all told without a single line of dialogue. It's incredibly emotional, moving, and uplifting. An entire playthrough will only take you about 1 to 2 hours, and when I did so to make this video, I went through the exact same emotions I did the first time. From playing this game, I feel like I finally understand why people enjoy art so much, with each person interpreting it in their own way, and sometimes even taking a different meaning each time you look at it, because this is exactly how I felt with Journey. For me, I felt a story of gradual dependence on technology taking away the meaning of love, family, and friendship, but the player on their journey slowly restores their inner peace and reconnects with the rest of its kind. It's a tale of community and togetherness that tells us that we mustn't get too reliant on technology and to make time for our loved ones. There's also a sense of overcoming adversity, and if you feel low, I genuinely think it's a game that can help lift your mood for an extended period of time. And I'd describe it as a cathartic experience, and I'll admit that each time I play it, I seem to well up. I'd highly recommend this to anyone who hasn't played it yet. Number 7, we have Bloodborne. Now, this was my first experience of From Software, or any Souls-like game really, and I was completely baffled at the beginning, but in a good way. Dying straight away to a weird wolf creature in a scary basement in a weird old house, picking up items that I had no idea what they even were, Does it even tell you controls in this game? I remember creating my character and just trying to make him look like a really disappointed middle-aged man who just hates his life and just goes around killing stuff. What a strange couple of hours that was. The sense of achievement anytime you kill a boss or even just find another lamp to go back to the hunter's dream is crazy. Speaking of the dream, what the hell is that? You're essentially in a dream where a Victorian sex doll upgrades you when you pour blood of dead monsters on it. It's a pretty strange idea, and I'm concerned for the mental well-being of the developers, but it is a really fun game. The visceral graphics and the tangible seeming controls where you can really somehow feel every hit through clever camera angles, sounds, and vibrations. It has some serious replayability, which is good because you need to replay sections over and over to collect enough blood echoes to upgrade your character. I still barely understand the story, but I understand there's some sort of blood-borne disease that essentially turns people into bloodthirsty killers and deforms them into massive trolls sometimes. And you're just a hunter who's trying to find the cure. But the mystery is one of the main exciting points of the story. A crazy game, and I think I'll be picking up the PS5 Demon Souls to experience the original in its full glory. Now at number 6, we have Spider-Man. Web swinging action at its best. Now, I remember the PS2 game of Spider-Man 2, where you used L2 and R2 for each arm when swinging. And when I heard this one was just R2, I was a bit disappointed as it sounded a bit more automated and less fun. But the moment you start playing, you instantly agree that they made a great choice. The combat is reminiscent of Batman, but of course it's a lot more acrobatic, being our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Really, the enjoyment of this game is mainly the city swinging, going up to the highest points, diving down as fast as you can, and then swinging up before you kiss the tarmac. Swinging in between cars, power jumping off traffic lights and through water towers. The fights are always fun, and the boss fights are great too. The Sinister Six are fun to fight. Each have their own styles. One of the best fights in the game for me is when you face Vulture, Rhino, and Shocker simultaneously. That is great web swinging and fly kicking action. You obviously also have your array of Spidey gadgets, from exploding webs to spider drones. You can also change into different suits whenever you like, and I had several favourites throughout the game, but the default one is also great. You get some fun rewards for completing side missions, mainly culminating in new suits, and that's always a good reward. The story was really well written, and I actually cared about the characters in a way that superhero games and even superhero films find it difficult with me. A great game from start to almost finish. For me, these open world games often lose their appeal about halfway, and the side missions certainly lost their appeal for me with Spider-Man. But the main story missions were varied up until the end, including the refreshingly different Mary Jane missions, which were much more stealth oriented. It was a very enjoyable game to play through, but just narrowly misses out on my top 5. Now, into the top 5. At 5, we have Ghost of Tsushima. Wow. My first thought when playing this game was simply wow, and that feeling pretty much stays with you for the entire game. It's such an astoundingly beautiful game, and the combat really makes you feel as close to a samurai as possible in a game. I love to perform perfect dodges to allow for deadly counter-strikes, and the feeling of walking away from a massive fight completely untouched is great. Having no map on the heads-up display and using the wind and wild animals to guide you is really innovative, and I expect to see many more games following suit in future, as it leads to a much more immersive experience. Not only that, but it allows you to appreciate the scenery a lot more, as you're not focusing on a map in the corner of the screen as you traverse the landscape. Little touches like the way Jin's hands reach out to flow through the tall grass as you gallop through are pretty small, but they make a nice difference. The story and the side missions are brutal and serve as a great juxtaposition of beauty and savagery with the scenery, and seem to perfectly encapsulate feudal Japan and the threat of the Mongols. As soon as I played this game, I proudly stated to my friends that it could perhaps be the best game I've ever played, and I stand by that. It's in my top 5, but on any other day it could even be higher. At 4, we've got Final Fantasy 15. I've always been a fan of Final Fantasy, with all the wacky villains, colourful enemies, and manga-style characters. One of the staples of the series, however, was the turn-based combat, and this was the first time I'd played a real-time action version of a Final Fantasy, and I have to admit that I was skeptical. I couldn't have been more wrong. The combat was an absolute joy, although the tutorial at the beginning was definitely necessary, as jumping in and out after a few years away was a lot more confusing than I remembered. Final Fantasy 15 takes the classic tropes of a Final Fantasy and souped them up to all the next gen PS4 glory. The story was as weird and moving as always, with the emotional twists and turns, such as, spoiler alert, Ignis going blind and Prompto discovering that he's only a robot. Like most Final Fantasy games, it's not just a game, it's a cinematic experience, and all the set pieces and boss battles are like a James Cameron movie, but you're controlling the action. As it proudly states on the intro screen as you load up the game, Final Fantasy 15 really is a game for fans of the series and first-time players alike. What a joy this was. At number 3, we got Assassin's Creed Black Flag. This, for me, was the first truly great single-player game on PS4, and also my favourite Assassin's Creed game by an absolute mile. While it wears its Assassin's Creed badge with pride, allowing you to sneak around, blend in with crowds, climb up landmarks, and dive off with a leap of faith, and of course assassinate people, this was a pretty big leap from any Assassin's Creed before it, and in my view was the high point of the entire series. As is the case with every AC, they took a genuinely interesting period of history and gave it a little nudge into the animus with its hidden blade. Sailing around with your best pal Blackbeard is what games were made to do, make you feel like the baddest mother around. Sailing about the open ocean and spearing whales and sharks is one of the great mini games in this outing, while diving into the depths to explore wreckages with the use of your diving bell is both exciting and scary as you manage your breath and stay away from sharks. The real star of this game is definitely the setting, colourful islands and strange temples to explore, while the combat is extremely satisfying with all the vivid finishing moves and variety of weaponry you'd expect from an AC title. Edward Kenway is definitely the coolest Welshman on screen, and he bears a striking resemblance to Charlie Hunnam, who's always a legend. You can pretend you're in the pirate version of Sons of Anarchy. Just don't mention journos, you can't stand him. Now, narrowly missing out at number 2, we have The Witcher 3. If I remember correctly, I picked this game up only for about £15 on the PlayStation Store as a bit of an impulse after one of my mates said it was good. What an understatement that turned out to be. Anyone who's played this game knows exactly how much of an absolute legend Geralt is, despite Henry Cavill's best efforts to remove any personality or likability from the character. You essentially play as Superman in a fantasy land, who has the strength and magic powers to kill anything he chooses. He can shoot fire and air from his hands, he can control mines, create a force field around himself, and he can also make purple runes on the floor that would be a welcome addition to any nightclub dance floor. Just imagine Big Geralt in the middle of the floor busting out his Witcher moves like the Wyvern Shuffle or the Drowner Bop. Watch the women flock to him. The choice system in this game unfortunately shows you that no good deed goes unpunished, like how deciding not to kill an ancient forest spirit leads to a friendly baron's suicide. Yes, that actually happens, unless you stab a tree, but that's just heartless. When you first sail over to Skellige, the scenery takes your breath away with all the new colours, while the city quests such as the vampire hiding in the loft of a lake house are like an episode of Buffy on steroids. Just trotting about on the back of Roach is fun, knowing that just yards away in any direction is a crazy monster to kill. It's also the classic story of the gruff hero who acts like he doesn't care about anything but always helps everyone, albeit oftentimes he does it for coin. But many times in this game you're able to let the contractors off, either not to pay you at all or just to pay you a lot less than you expected. Money isn't very important in this game, so it's always nice to boost Geralt's reputation by being nice. Unless it's in Gwent, the card-based minigame, where I'm an absolute monster and I will happily take everyone's best cards. The fights are extremely varied, and in many there is a specific way to kill the enemy and you have to work it out for yourself. Usually it's relatively obvious, but it definitely keeps every fight a bit fresh. Scouting out areas and acting like a detective to work out what's happened in a particular instance gives this game a crime-solving element, which is rightfully a popular trend among single-player games. It helps to space out the fighting, and it all comes together into a real masterpiece. The story is also interesting and varied. There's the loss of a father figure, the search for a daughter figure, and of course there's love interests along the way, all while you prepare to fight off otherworldly threats. It sounds almost like a Marvel movie, and I hear they're pretty popular. Now, we've got to number 1. This is without doubt my favourite ever PS4 game. Can you guess what it is? I'll give you 3 words. God of War. For those of you who've only played the earlier versions, this game is no longer the crazy hack and slash of the older titles, but more of a Souls-like inspired combat. I say inspired because it's still nowhere near as tough as those, but let's be honest, it shouldn't be tough since you're playing as the literal god of war, Kratos, who's left Greece to peacefully live with his wife and son in the woods in Midgard. Unfortunately, his wife has just died and you must journey with your son to the highest point in the land to lay your wife's ashes. It seems for the majority of the game to be a simple request of a dying woman to be laid somewhere pretty, and a loving husband trying to show his love for her by keeping his word, but you gradually discover that she's given him this somewhat vague request so that he can find out life-changing information about the world and their family. Obviously, being a God of War game, you run into well-known gods and mythical beings, including Baldur, Freya, and the World Serpent, who absolutely steals the show whenever it's on screen, even when you venture into its stomach to rummage about. The growing affection and connection between father and son, from harsh and impatient to encouraging and loving, is pretty uplifting, with the subtle differences in the way Kratos almost exclusively refers to him as boy for the majority of the game, until he begins to call him Atreus towards the end. All of that said, and despite the story being one of the truly great stories in gaming, the real attraction of this game obviously is the combat. And I say with complete confidence that this is the absolute best hand-to-hand melee-based combat in any game I've ever played. The axe feels weighty, and smashing it into Draugrs is one of the most satisfying things in any game I've ever played, as is ripping them apart when you've stunned them. Having your son shoot lightning wolves and energy ravens is so cool, and the absolute madness that you see on screen in big fights is a joy to behold. Switching up between your chain blades once you get them and your axe, throwing your axe away and pummeling monsters with your fist before recalling your axe into a big overhead smash and a splash of ice back into the chain blades in a swirl of fire and mayhem is what gaming dreams are made of. Killing dragons and gods, seeing Zeus's face in a massive cloud chasing you on a flying ship in the realm of the dead, all while running around with an all-knowing talking severed head bouncing around on your bum. It sounds mental, and that's because it is. Yet it all still seems like it could perfectly fit into Norse mythology, and the ending, without spoiling it, as I really hope if any of you haven't played it that I've convinced you to do so, is a truly moving ending, and I, for one, can't wait to play Ragnarok on PS5, a worthy number one in any list of games. Now, I know there are so many massive AAA titles that I haven't included that different people will be either thinking I'm crazy for not including or that I simply know nothing about games. So I look forward to seeing in some of the comments which ones I've missed out and which ones you guys rate as your favourite of all time, or to simply debate my list and see which ones you'd maybe forgotten about or were glad to see me include as you feel like they're often underappreciated. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for watching.